What is the Old Testament? For many readers today, when we hear the words Old Testament, our minds automatically leap to ancient Israel and thinking of Hebrew or Aramaic writings from that world. But the reality is, for many ancient Jews across the ancient world, as well as eventually the early Christian communities, when they read the Hebrew scriptures, they did so in Greek. In this episode, we're going to explore the Septuagint. What is it? Where does it come from? How is it the same or different from other versions of the Hebrew scriptures that we know about? And then also, how do you get into it today with some modern resources to introduce you to this ancient translation that we call the Septuagint? There are many themes that define the story of the Hebrew scriptures, but one of them I would argue is almost on every single page is empire. Because empires were part of every feature of life in the ancient world, particularly in this part of the ancient Near East. When empires set up shop or overturned one another, many things changed. One of them that came with those imperial changes was language. In the mid-4th century, Alexander the Great sweeps across the Mediterranean coast and presses all the way across the ancient Near East until modern-day India and becomes the effective leader and new empire of the Hellenistic world in the ancient Near East after the Persians. Now, in his wake, he left many things in that push across the then-known world. One of them was language. From this point on, we see Greek increasingly become a common language of culture and communication in the ancient Near East. Now, as ancient Jewish communities are spread across this now imperial diaspora, either by need or desire, we see a driving force to translate their Hebrew scriptures into Greek. And when we talk about the Septuagint, we're not talking about just one manuscript. We're talking about any collection of manuscripts that are unified by that Greek language that are translations of the Hebrew scriptures. Now, we see ancient fragments of this, for example, in the Dead Sea Scrolls, as well as other sites in the ancient Near East. But eventually, it's in our 4th and 5th century codices, early forms of books, that we have our most comprehensive representations of the Hebrew scriptures in Greek, the Septuagint. So, for example, items such as Sinaiticus, which you're seeing images of here, as well as other codices like Alexandrinus and Vaticanus. In these collections of what are we eventually calling early Christian scripture, we have Christian communities inheriting the Hebrew scriptures in Greek, as well as a collection of writings that we eventually call the Apocrypha, and then in these codices also writings of the New Testament. Now, if we want to study the origins of the Septuagint, we've got to go read the letter of Aristeas. And like any ancient text, it demands our interpretation, because Aristeas tells a rather legendary mythic account of the beginnings of the Septuagint. As the story goes in that text, the Ptolemaic Hellenistic king in Alexandria commissioned his librarian to invite some translators from Jerusalem to copy and translate the Hebrew scriptures into Greek. We're told that the high priest sent 72 translators, scribes, and nobility from Jerusalem to the island of Pharos in Alexandria, outside of Alexandria, and they retreated to their own solitary cells to translate the scriptures. Now, surprise, surprise, when they all came out and compared their notes, everybody translated the same thing. Now, if that happens in one of my classes today, I'd call that plagiarism, but you can see the rhetoric here in Aristeas. It's not about plagiarism, it's in fact about providence. Is to present this as a legitimate, authentic representation of ancestral traditions that were once in Hebrew and are now in Greek. So what does this tell us about the ancient world? Well, there are many lessons we could learn from the Septuagint, and in a minute we'll look at a few examples of actual texts. One of the things we could say is it's an essential resource for the text-critical study of the Hebrew scriptures. What were the forms of Hebrew scriptures in the ancient world, and what forms are behind the Septuagint, this Greek translation? We could also then see that it gives us incredible insight into our earliest, most comprehensive translation enterprise of the ancient world. In terms of culture, we could also see that this connects us in many important ways to different patterns of Jewish cultural thought across the diaspora. This was not only the scriptures of many diaspora Jews, it's also translated presumably by scribes and scholars that know something about that world and are trying to speak into it. Now, eventually for the early church, we could say there's a canonical contribution to be made here, because when we're studying the Septuagint, it originates as early Jewish scripture, but it's received by specifically ancient Christians in the early church as their scripture and their inheritance. So when we think about the Septuagint and that bigger backstory, we might start with empires, Alexander the Great, but eventually what we're talking about is something that's of great textual significance, translational significance, canonical significance, and cultural significance for studying ancient Judaism and Christianity in antiquity. One of the main reasons that scholars study the Septuagint today is for its text-critical impact. Because if you study the Septuagint, there's a way of almost reverse engineering that Greek translation and getting new insight into Hebrew texts, ancient and often lost Hebrew texts that would have been behind those translations. So let's look at just one example of the impact of this. Let's look at 1 Samuel 17:4, David and Goliath. But how tall was Goliath? How tall was this epic giant on the Philistine army? Most of us are familiar with a very tall figure that if you look at this in most modern versions of scripture, as well as the Masoretic text, which they're based on, you have Goliath weighing in at about 9 foot 6 inches. The text will say 6 cubits in a span. To put that in perspective, if you open up the Guinness Book of World Records and look up the record for the world's tallest living man, this is a record bit that's been in place for more than 60 years of a figure who is as tall as 8 foot 11 inches. In the Septuagint, we have the measurement of 4 cubits in a span. So what does that look like in our own measurements today? It's about 6 foot 6. Still pretty tall. If you're a fan of the NBA, this is the exact same height as Michael Jordan and Kobe Bryant, who are tall by most standards, but certainly average for the NBA. So which one is it? If we were to kind of map this out across a broader collection of manuscripts, we'd find that shorter giant, like in the Septuagint, that 4.5 cubits of a measurement, that reading was actually also discovered eventually in a manuscript of the Dead Sea Scrolls, a Hebrew manuscript. Now, what does that tell us? It tells us that in this case, the Septuagint translator, having that shorter Goliath, was faithfully translating a Hebrew text that we didn't know about until, for example, the study of the scrolls, that type of reading existed. That means that our oldest text is most likely of a shorter Goliath. So when we're thinking about the Septuagint, we have an opportunity to look at it for text-critical insight to recover lost readings of scripture that sometimes show up in the Septuagint, sometimes are substantiated by the scrolls, but give us insight into that backstory of lost textual variants that at times are now updating our modern Bibles. At times, the early Greek scriptures, the Septuagint, are essential for how we understand the early reception history by authors and communities as they're looking at the ancestral traditions of ancient Israel and trying to make sense of them in their own day. Now, we see this almost right away in the Septuagint in Genesis 2:2. Now, we all know that the Genesis creation stories have many complexities to them, but one of them is this rhythm, this poetic rhythm of days of creation. And one of the reasons for that is to establish the foundation of the Sabbath, of rest. In Genesis 2:2, however, we have a textual variant, a difference between our Greek scriptures and our Hebrew scriptures. The Hebrew scriptures present the text in a way that suggests that God finished working perhaps on the seventh day, and then he took a rest. Now, this is an interpretive issue. Did God finish working before the Sabbath, or would he finish work after the Sabbath or on the Sabbath? The text is honestly a bit ambiguous. The first individual that we know about ever to ask that question or to see that issue is the translator of Septuagint Genesis. Because when we flip to Genesis 2:2 in the Greek scriptures, it suggests, in fact, it changes that reference to the seventh day to the sixth day. And what that does now is we have a text where God, yes, absolutely rested on the Sabbath in its entirety. Why? Because he completed his work on the sixth day. Now, this is an example, unlike the previous one of the height of Goliath, where we could say that the Septuagint is now a valuable source not for the text criticism of the Hebrew Scriptures, but for understanding how this ancient translator wrestled with the text. That translator saw something, an interpretive issue, and part of their job, ancient scribes and translators, was not just to be a photocopy and replicate the text. It was in fact to make sense of the text. And in this case, the translator stepped into the tradition, made sense of it with a slight adaptation from 7 down to 6, and addressed that issue of when did God establish the Sabbath and how is that built into the creative order. So far I've been talking all about the Septuagint in the ancient world. Well, what about today? What if you want to get into this text for personal study or academic study, or just to encounter the Hebrew Scriptures, the Old Testament, in a very different way? If you want to do that in the primary languages, there's a number of different places you could go to. In print editions, you're probably looking at your first access point being something called Rolf's Septuagint. And what Rolf's Septuagint is a collection really of all of those books. It's not exactly a critical edition, but it'll give you a good baseline for starting to work through the translation of the Hebrew Scriptures in Greek and to get a sense of just the feel of that in its original language. You could also get into a more comprehensive critical edition called the Göttingen Septuagint. And what you get here, for example, is individual books, now literally in individual books of the Septuagint with full primary texts. Sometimes if there's more than one version, they present both, as well as critical apparatuses of differences of textual variants, so you can really dig deep into that textual backstory of the Septuagint. But what if you want a real live book? There are now 2 major projects that have come out to invite you into this world in English, and they both have their own strengths and assets because they're approaching the Septuagint in 2 different ways. The first one is called the New English Translation of the Septuagint, or NETS for short. It's an incredible project that tries to get you into that background of the Septuagint. How did the translation sound and feel when it was produced? So we're talking about kind of text critical origins. They're trying to put a English translation in your hands that gives you the feel of that as produced ancient Greek translation. Now, NETS, they've done something clever here. They started off with the New Revised Standard Version and then took all of those differences that we find in the Septuagint and built it into that translation, as well as kind of adapted some of its syntax and language and style to connect you with that feeling. Now, another resource that's come out rather recently, in fact, very recently, is out of Lexham Press, and it's called the Lexham English Septuagint. Now, what is this and how is it different? Well, the first thing you could say is this is just a stunning book. It's absolutely beautiful. I bring home a lot of books, either from conferences and libraries, and this one was the only one that anybody in my house said, wow, I would actually read that. What you get on the inside of this is a translation of the Septuagint, but in a different way, in a different direction than NETS. This translation has a different philosophy. They want to connect you with the Septuagint as it was received. And because of that, they use one manuscript as their base text. And the base text in this project is Codex Vaticanus, which is one of those 4th century codices we mentioned earlier. Now, in this translation, what you get is a beautiful flowing translation that's trying to give you that sense of not just the feel of the Greek translation, but how it would have sounded in the early centuries of the Common Era as people accessed it in many ways through kind of one type of manuscript tradition. But if you're looking to get into the Septuagint, which one of these do you need? Well, both. That's the easy answer. Because if you have both of them, you can get a sense of text critically what's going on, how are there differences that are being navigated and mediated in that early translation process. And then from the other side of the equation, as received, how did this sound and feel to ancient early Jewish or early Christian communities as they're reading these now, not just as a translation, but as a received text in their communities and traditions. Well, thanks for joining me on this first journey through the Septuagint. If you are interested in this world of translations of scribes and scrolls in the ancient world and then down to today, please subscribe to this channel, leave me a like. If you have a question or a comment about the Septuagint, let me know in the comments section. I'll do my best to get back to you. Otherwise, thanks for being here. We'll see you next time on Inscribed. I mean, look at this book. It's absolutely stunning. I mean, it even smells good. Okay, that was too much.